Well, it was a cold night in December, or at least it must have been, given I recall the Christmas tree still being up in our house. I remember the tree specifically because, well, that's where the bird flew when I opened the door. And not just one bird, but two birds, right straight into our Christmas tree. Apparently they'd been nesting in the wreath on the front door of our house, so when I opened the door, of course, naturally they thought it was an invitation. Now, while many of you know that snakes are my biggest fear, what you may not know is that birds run a close second. So you can understand why I ran for cover, thinking nothing of protecting my family, although they did finally manage to join me as we peered over the couch at the now bird-infested Christmas tree. Unsure of what to do, I decided to follow in the footsteps of one Clark W. Griswold from Christmas Vacation by running to the closet and getting my coat, and then to the garage to get a hammer. I still to this day do not know what either one was going to accomplish. In the midst of rummaging through my toolbox, though, I heard screaming from the living room like what you'd hear from Alfred Hitchcock's movie, The Birds. And by the time I got back to my family, they'd informed me that one of the birds had now flown back outside the front door, but the other had now flown deeper into our house, into the laundry room. At this point, I looked to Marion and asked very kindly if she might consider go shooing the bird out of the laundry room. You can imagine she did not dignify that question with a response. So I put on my big boy pants, I put a blanket over my head, and I grabbed my hammer, and I told my family, whatever you do, when I go in there and close this door behind me, no matter what I say, don't open this door. So I crept in the laundry room, blanket over my head, hammer in hand, and slowly opened the laundry room window. Thankfully there was a window, hoping the bird might immediately fly out. When it didn't, I decided to improvise. So I began a kind of dance, yelling and screaming and clapping, trying to stir the bird to fly out the window. When the bird started sporadically flying around the room, though, I immediately began pounding on the door to let me out. Of course, they'd locked it as I instructed them. Finally, I got down on the floor really quiet, and I reached up and I turned off the light, hoping that that might calm this bird down, and me too, for that matter. Almost immediately, I heard the bird's wings stop fluttering. I turned on the light, and the bird was gone. After convincing my family that the bird in fact had flown back outside, they finally let me back into the house, although I wasn't sure what had made the bird immediately fly out that window. And so I did what anyone does in that situation. I Googled it, only to discover that birds are actually attracted to light. If a bird, for future reference, ever gets in your garage or into your home for some reason, apparently you're supposed to turn off all the lights and then open a window near a light, and the bird will fly toward the light and escape safely. That's the power of light, isn't it? It has a way of drawing creation toward it, like the bugs that fly toward the lamp in your living room, or the children who chase after fireflies on a warm summer night, and the flowers that stretch and bloom toward the sunlight each and every day. In fact, light is so attractive, so powerful, it seems to always find a way in. I have a colleague who cannot stand to sleep in a room that has any light in it. It has to be completely pitch black. No glow of an alarm clock or pinhole light on the television or night light in the hallway. In fact, when he travels, he carries with him electrical tape to cover up the light. He's constantly getting frustrated because somehow, even despite all of his efforts, light seems to somehow find a way to ruin the darkness. Well, believe it or not, salt is not all that different. I suppose that's the reason for which Jesus mentions both in our reading this morning. While it may be ubiquitous today and seem even rather to be a common element, throughout history it's been considered just as important, even as powerful as something like light. Homer called it divine. Plato called it a substance dear to the gods. Shakespeare mentions salt some 17 times in his plays. Of course, in ancient Greece, a far-flung trade involving the exchange of salt for slaves gave rise to the expression, "not worth his salt." Special salt rations were given to Roman soldiers and known as salarium argentims, the forerunner of the English word salary. Indeed, wars have been won and lost on the basis of who has control of the stores of salt. Governments have found salt to be a lucrative means of raising money by controlling it and taxing it. Even Scripture refers to the significance of salt over and over again. Like in 2 Kings when the prophet Elisha sprinkled salt into the spring at Jericho to purify the water. Or in the book of Numbers, to eat salt with a person is a sign of loyalty, sort of a passing of the peace pipe, a breaking of bread, a sign of commonality, if you will. In Ezekiel, priests strew salt on sacrifices, seasoned incense with salt, and parents rub salt all over their newborn baby's body as protection against all kinds of ills. All of this, of course, because until 100 years ago, salt was almost sacred. While we think of it mostly as flavoring our food, salt has had thousands of purposes throughout time. Even today, it softens our water and melts the ice on our roadways, and when gargled, can soothe a sore throat, to name just a few. But in Jesus' time, it was scarcely available. And having it or not, like light, could be the difference between life and death. Which is what makes Jesus' words in our reading this morning so, well, troubling. At least for me. I mean, it's one thing to strive to be salt and light. And that's part of being a person of faith. We're to attempt every day to follow Jesus, to love our neighbors, to live lives of faith. We should be salt. We shall be light. The only problem is that's not what Jesus says. I wonder if you caught it. Jesus doesn't say you should be salt, you should be light. No, he says you are the salt. You are the light. And there's a difference. I learned a lesson early on in my marriage, and that is the best way to ensure that Marion not do something is to tell her she should do it. You know, like subtly asking why dinner was not yet made, or joking that the laundry wasn't going to fold itself. If you're newly married, please learn from my mistakes. The truth is, though, it's part of the human condition. My guess is that for most of us, the surefire way to get us to go the other direction is to command us which direction to go. It's just not very inspiring to follow a command. It's just not all that meaningful to do only what you're told. It's just not all that life-giving to do something because you fear for your life. Which is the way so many of us think of God, that God is this divine lawmaker and rule enforcer, setting expectations which few of us, if any, can meet. And yet we constantly strive to be this salt and light, that we might earn a point in some celestial scorekeeping endeavor which determines who enters the kingdom of God and who's relegated to the darkness. It's no wonder so many of us give up. But what if God is simply a divine gift giver? What if being a person of faith isn't so much about what we do, but about who we are? What if it isn't so much about purpose as it is promise? What if it's not so much about following commands as it is already having been commissioned? I can remember reading somewhere along the way that psychologists suggest that for every negative message elementary-age children hear about themselves, they need to hear 10 positive ones to restore their sense of self-esteem when it had been lost previously. Frankly, I don't know if anyone studied this in groups other than young children, but I suspect the number doubles during adolescence and then recedes back to about 10 to 1 again by adulthood. To put it another way, children respond to what they are named. Call a child bad long enough and he or she will believe you are to act accordingly. Call a child or teen or adult for that matter worthless or unlovable or shameful, and eventually he or she, all of us, will live into the name we've been given. But in the same way, call us good or useful or dependable or helpful or worthwhile, and we'll respond in kind. Do you see the difference? We do the work of ministry not to earn a title, but because it's already our title. We follow Jesus not to strive to be someone we have not yet become, but because that's already who we are. We don't give of ourselves out of obligation or even because there's a need, but because it's the only way we know to respond to the gift we've already been given. And I say this is troubling because if this is true, isn't more expected of us? I mean, if we're only striving to be salt and light but not yet there, then we have an excuse, right? The stakes just don't seem as high. Of course, that depends upon how you see things. Or at least that's what I was reminded of earlier this week. I was speaking with one of you about a new role that you had taken on at the church. And I was thanking for this person for the time and effort they were going to be putting into our ministry in this next year, expecting her to say something like, well, I was worried there wasn't going to be anyone else to do it, or I just felt like I should, or I knew I could fill the need. Instead, she said, I just see it as a real opportunity. And that's the difference. If we're only following commands, then coming to worship on Sunday morning is an obligation. If we're only following rules, then giving our time and resources to the church becomes simply filling a need or meeting a commitment. If we're only fulfilling obligations, then loving our neighbor becomes a duty. Look, it's not that being a person of faith isn't about a sense of obligation. My goodness, where would the Church Universal be without the saints who stepped in out of a sense of duty? It's just that it's so much more than that. Isn't it? Some of you know Ann Butts, who's a member of this congregation. I got her permission to share this story this week. For the last several years, Ann suffered from chronic, severe pain. Quite frankly, she suffers every day. She's consulted with everyone from doctors at Mayo to healing ministries in Dalton, none of whom have been able to help her be fully rid of her pain. She's having a procedure done this week, and so I went to visit her on Friday. Toward the end of our visit, we shared communion and had a prayer. And then I said to her, I just can't imagine all that you've been through. I'm so sorry for the way you've suffered for so long. Without hesitation, she responded, it's been hard, I'm not going to lie. But I see it as a way for me to help others. I'm always looking for ways that my suffering might heal someone else's. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Which turns out not to just be a reminder from Jesus, but from chemistry, too. I was doing some research this week. Not only does the human body literally glow, emitting light in extremely small quantities at levels that rise and fall with the day, as you know, so too is our body made up of sodium. We need it, in fact, to live. What I did not think about was that like light, salt too has an uncanny way of finding its way in. Apparently, salt is a stable compound with positive and negative ions, polar opposites, which allow it to so easily dissolve and spread into a larger surrounding substance. It's no wonder Jesus was preaching this message not just to his disciples, but to a large, diverse crowd. Polar opposites, I suspect. Conservative and liberal, dark skin and light skin, gay and straight, rich and poor. After all, even then, people of faith of every kind were flavoring the world and ruining the darkness. I know especially these days it's hard to see. But take a look again this week in your life. I think you'll be reminded. Salt and light, they're everywhere.